So my name's Joanne Owen, and today I'm here to talk to you about how to inspire children to write for pleasure. I'll just start off by giving a little bit of my background. As a writer for children and a reviewer of children's books with a background in children's publishing, my professional life has long centred around reading for pleasure and also delivering events and workshops in schools that seek to inspire writing for pleasure. My career has seen me immersed in children's books. I've worked for a number of children's publishers, for example, Bloomsbury, Macmillan, Walker Books and Nosy Crow. I've also worked for a children's magazine called Scoop, which was founded around that same principle of inspiring children to explore the world through reading fiction and non-fiction for pleasure. I'm also an editorial expert for a big book recommendation website called Love Reading for Kids, which helps parents, teachers and children find books to read for pleasure through reviews, articles and curated themed collections. And I'm also working on a writing project for the National Literacy Trust, a literacy charity here in the UK. This is called Story Quest, and it's a community project designed to inspire families in deprived areas of the UK to get active and discover local nature and history. Again, it's another project that's all about the pleasure to be had from words and through children reading stories and then being inspired by stories to write their own. In terms of my own books, slight problem with the slide. In terms of my own books, I've written across a number of different age groups. So I've got a young fiction series called Martha Mayhem, which is kind of for, I guess, 7+-year-olds. And I've also written a few historical novels for, I guess, 10 to 11-year-olds. And most recently, I've written You Can Write Awesome Stories, which is published by Collins. And this really is a book that's basically based on designed to inspire a love of reading in a broadish age group, probably 7+. You can kind of use it in lots of different ways for different age groups, probably beginning at 7. It's a practical guidebook with information about the nuts and bolts of writing, presented through and integrated into lots of fun activities. And I guess the overall ethos of the book is that anyone can write, and writing is a pleasurable activity, the same as that of this presentation. And really a lot of the ideas and content of this book was inspired by school events and workshops that I've done here in the UK and also in the Caribbean. And basically, whenever I'm covering whether I'm covering specific novels in my events, like I might do events around Martha Mayhem or some of the historical novels. So whether I'm doing events based on particular books or doing general writing workshops, my events with children are delivered really from a whole writing for pleasure perspective. And this really seeks to show good reasons to write and good reasons to write well. They tried to show that writing is a really fabulous form of communication, and it's all about really getting kids to understand that writing is a form of putting your personality into something. It's about showing who you are. And also they seek to foster a sense of satisfaction from creating something unique. More practically, in these workshops, I try to stoke inspiration and ideas for stories. And I also try to provide a framework of activities so students can develop those ideas for themselves. And I also try to foster motivation from the sense of agency writing gives, especially when you've got an audience and you've got a sense of purpose, you know why you're writing. And another element I always try to do is to foster collaboration, to show that writing can be social in terms of how you come up with ideas and how you present your creations to audiences. So I think writing often is a solo activity, but actually I think it's quite inspirational for kids to see it's something you can do together. And all of the elements I just went through are set in a wider perspective, really a perspective that's framed with an approach that believes writing for pleasure goes hand in hand with writing for purpose, understanding why people write and what writing is for. And this approach is designed to make writing real, to connect it to real writers and to connect it to students' real lives. Because I think really at heart, I really believe that writing for pleasure goes hand in hand with writing for purpose. And I think that there are kind of three main ways that I try to give writing a sense of purpose and to make it seem real to students. Firstly, through making writers seem real. And by that I mean encouraging children to discover and understand how real writers generate their ideas and what motivates them to write. Whether we're looking at specific books, what were their inspiration behind specific books, or generally in terms of their motivation to write. And the second area I think that's important is to make writing assignments and projects seem real and authentic to students, so they've got a real sense of purpose and a real reason to write. And thirdly, another way of making writing real to students is through giving them agency to choose what they write about. So I'll just go through each of those points in a little bit more detail. So discovering how writers generate their ideas and what motivates them to write. So I'll give a few examples from how I do that in my workshops. In my presentations, I might talk about how my first novel, Puppet Master, was inspired by visits to the city of Prague and by doing research into its marionette tradition and its mythology. So in that case, I would share with students that my motivation was to want to share my love of the city, to share my love of its myths and its folklore and its theatre. And then I might go on to explain that my Martha Mayhem books for younger readers was inspired by personal experiences. Some of the adventures in there were things my sister and I used to get up to when we were about Martha's age, and also inspired by a love of eccentric characters. And I might also explain that because the books are kind of funny and a bit silly, I was really motivated by wanting to make my readers laugh. I wanted to entertain them. And then to use another example, I might pick someone like Michael Morpurgo, for example, and talk through a few of his books and explain that how a lot of his historical fiction is motivated by his desire to tell lesser known true life tales, so more people know about incredible figures from the past, so more people know about what happened in the past. So after I've kind of set that in context and given examples from myself and a few other authors, I'd then go on to do an activity for the whole class. I would ask them to pick an author that maybe you've read as a whole class group, and then research why that particular author writes, what's their motivation, and what's the inspiration behind their specific books. And then leading on from that, I'd ask them to think about who their favourite author is, or who or what their all-time favourite books are, and give them the task of finding out what motivated the author to write that. So again, you can see that sense of agency coming through there. And it's really, this exercise is really about them understanding how real writers work, how they think, and that there's a reason to the stories, there's a reason behind the stories. And just quickly, a few ideas about how you can do that. Alongside reading author biographies, and there might be notes in the back of the book and all of that kind of thing, you can actually maybe reach out to authors direct on social media, especially Twitter, Facebook. Also contact their publisher, and if you've got sort of questions from the students, it's quite good to kind of frame them very clearly, and the publisher will pass them on to the author. And I think especially if you've got specific questions, they're more than happy to get back to you. And one other suggestion I'd like to make in terms of reaching out to authors is a project I'm involved with called the Book Pen Pals project. If you check out the website bookpenpals.com. This was founded by, it's a free platform, and it was founded by a former publisher and a children's author. And it basically partners authors and illustrators with classes. So basically what happens is you're paired with them for a whole school year. And during this time, the author or illustrator will send your class book recommendations. So it'll just be books that the authors have loved and they'd like to recommend to your class. And then usually the class will write back, so you might get, as a lucky author, you might get a whole stack of illustrations and letters from the class, which is absolutely fantastic from the writer's point of view. And then at the same time, the author will then send another postcard back or send some letters back. And basically over time a really great bond developed. And you can, I mean, one thing I do in this context is I'll send writing tips to the class, or I've had teachers get in touch, and if they're working on a specific project, I don't know if, for example, if they're learning how to write scary stories or they're working on a newspaper project, I might send them writing recommendations. So anyway, that's just one way I'd really recommend if you want to form sort of longer term relationships with authors and illustrators. So now moving on to the second point. So we've just covered how we can make writers seem real. And the next point I think that's really important is to make writing real through having a real sense of purpose. In other words, giving students a reason to write. So to do this, I'd sort of suggest trying to frame every writing assignment with its purpose, even if you're covering very specific areas. So take descriptive writing, for example, which is a very specific area that you might need to cover. For example, in that case, you could explain that using descriptive language will make their writing more impactful. It will be more engaging to their readers. So in that context, it's worth paying attention and learning to make your written work, your writing more impactful and more magical and more descriptive. The reason there is because it will be more engaging to your readers. I think a sense of purpose is more obvious and more easily understood if you give students bigger context to work in. For example, will their short stories or their writing be published in a school magazine or a newspaper? Or maybe it will be showcased at a school book festival, or maybe it will be entered into a competition like the Collins Big Cat competition. Or maybe it's because you're sending work to a writer that you've been researching or you've been in touch with. All of these ideas provide a bigger context, a bigger reason and a bigger framework in which you can make writing real. They offer an audience which hopefully will bring extra motivation for the teachers, for the students, will bring extra satisfaction, and then actually will end up with more motivation for the future. We'll come back to some of these bigger context ideas in more detail later. But now I'll move on to my third point, making writing real through giving students real agency. I think really giving students agency to choose what they write about can be a real motivator and lead to more creative work, as opposed to always prescribing the same topics, which can result in ideas being stale and the writing feeling a bit forced. Kind of reinforcing what I've just said, agency will make them more interested, more invested in the writing, which will lead to better writing, which means they've got great satisfaction, and hopefully they'll be more motivated for future assignments. So next, we're going to go a little bit deeper into different ways of finding writing topics, to finding inspiration for creative writing, and mainly at this point, writing stories, although we'll touch on some non-fiction ideas a little later on. So when I begin my story writing workshops, I begin by asking students what they think a good story needs. Really, I do that so their own subsequent story ideas and writing is framed with those elements in mind. So when I ask that, I'm usually met with suggestions like it needs punctuation, it needs capital letters, it needs paragraph breaks, you need to use metaphors. And while I say yes, all these things are very important and all these things will make your writing stronger. And as a result, it will make your writing more appealing to your readers. I ask them to take a step back from that in my events and say, actually, what we need to focus on is understanding what a good story does. That is how it affects you, how it makes you feel. So then I'll ask students to tell me about books and films that they rate and to really get to the heart of why they rate them, why they love those particular books. I ask them to share as a group what they think is good about them and how the books made them feel. How the stories affected them? Did it make them think? Did it make them laugh? Did it make them feel excited, scared, or happy? I tried to draw out their personal responses to stories they love. And really this discussion tries to distill the point of stories, the point of writing. It tries to foster personal enthusiasm so they kind of get excited about sharing stories that they love. And actually, I think it's important to open it up at this stage so we can also talk about films or other forms of storytelling, because I think it can be a really not all kids kind of recognise that there are different forms of storytelling. So I think it opens up if they also think of movies they like within that context. So really it kind of gets to, as I said, try to distill the point of stories, and leads to revealing that as a writer, in the same way that the authors you love or the film directors you like, as a writer, as the creator, you've got the power to do this to your readers, to affect them, to have an impact on them, which I think again gives students a sense of agency. So we're back again to that point about making writing real, making it personal, back to giving the students agency, and back to giving them a reason to write. So now on to writing itself. Well, almost. There's still a few more stages that I like to go through first, because before you can start writing a story, of course, you need something to write about. You need an idea. And I think sometimes for maybe less imaginative or less confident students, the blank page or the fear of the blank page can be a really huge obstacle. Often students will say, I don't know what to write, I can't think of anything to write. And so to try and overcome that, I use a few collective off-the-page group activities that lead to on-the-page writing. That's to say, we collectively start to develop stories aloud as a group. And I've delivered quite a lot of whole workshops using what I call the Every Object Tells a Story activity. And this is all around sparking inspiration from objects. So we'll use objects as the basis of a story. And to show the purpose of this activity, so we're back to, again, showing that there's a reason for this activity, which in this case is to inspire story ideas. And to show that this story actually, that this technique actually works, that there's a reason for it, I'll use some personal context and show examples from my books. So I'll show objects that have inspired some of the stories. So for example, I might show, I usually come along with a bag of different funny objects to inspire them. Hopefully you can see that, but I might show some of the marionettes that inspired my Puppet Master book. And sort of explain a bit of the history behind that. And I might show some of the Russian dolls that inspired my book, Circus of the Unseen. And if I'm talking about Martha Mayhem, I might show them some of the mysterious masks from my collection that inspired a character in Martha Mayhem's Balmy Birthday. And I'll kind of go through and explain how these objects tell a story and they actually inspired my own story. And I also, in this context, mention that writers in a lot of ways are a bit like archaeologists and explorers, digging up ideas and investigating stories through objects, which is something that you can kind of come back to if you're thinking about, especially if you're working on adventure stories, which I think that's kind of a nice playful way to think about it. So that's how I'll sort of show from my own experience how objects can be used to spark stories. So you could do something similar and maybe use, kind of do a bit of research and use examples from other writers. So in terms of the practical activity for Every Object Tells a Story, I'll show students a selection object, so it might be some of the ones I've just shown you, and I'll also bring a whole bag or a box of other objects as well. Things like maps, ornaments, keys, jewelleries, figurines. Maps and postcards often work really well. So I'll pick one, this is another group activity to begin with. So I'll pick one of the objects at random and I'll pose questions about it to the group. And from the answers to those questions, we'll start to collectively build a story. Things like, what is it? Where did it come from? Who does it belong to? Does it have any special value? Maybe it's kind of a high monetary value, maybe it's got a lot of sentimental value. Does it remind you of someone special? Does it have any magic powers even? Who's got it? Does somebody want it? Where did they find it? And all of these questions and students' answers to the questions can start to build a story. And obviously from that one exercise, you can collectively build a big story, or it can actually lead off to students writing their own individual stories. Talking of which, after we've done that as a group exercise, I'll usually give out workshops, worksheets, which basically include some of the questions that I've just gone through. And then I'll ask students to pick a fresh object, or preferably they might want to bring in something of their own from home, something that inspires them, something that means something to them. And then they can write their answers on the worksheet. And from that, they can go on to, they'll have the bones of a story, and they can go along and write up that story. Which is why I might then move on to talking about the bare bones of structure. So they've kind of got some of the structure laid out from following that worksheet, but then next I will kind of give them a bit more context for that. And so we're going to look at how we're going to structure it and introduce the basics of plotting. So I will then explain, using the idea of a 3-course meal, I'll explain that the starter needs to grab readers' attention. It needs to set the scene. It's when you first meet your readers, will first meet your characters. It's when they first meet your story world. But I also like to give them a big sense of agency, even thinking about this, explaining it's their story, how it starts is up to them, and there are so many different ways you could do it. You might start with a shocking, surprising event. You might start with atmospheric description, or maybe it will start with intriguing dialogue. It's up to you. Then I'll move on to the main course and explain that the middle of the story is when matters get meaty for your main character. It's when the action really gets going. It's when the characters might face perils or an enemy or conflict or someone gets in their way. It's when things get dramatic. And then moving on to the dessert, I explain this is when you bring everything together in a satisfying way. But again, there are so many different ways you can do this. There's no right or wrong answer. Will it have a happy ending? Will it have a surprising ending? Will there be a cliffhanger that will keep readers hungry for more, maybe allowing for a sequel? However you frame it, I emphasise it's their choice and there are tons and tons of options. So before we move on to activities that delve into different story elements in detail, things like character, empathy, dialogue, descriptive language, atmosphere, and a sense of place, I just wanted to share a few other ways, a few other general ways that I use to inspire, to spark story ideas. First up, story starters, which I'm sure a lot of you have already used. It's a commonly used and simple tool, providing opening lines or story titles that they can use as a springboard. So to begin with, I usually do this aloud again as a whole group, inviting students to ask questions again about a scenario suggested by the opening line or the title. For example, if we take one of the examples here that's from You Can Write Awesome Stories, let's pick Help, My Little Sister's a Snake. So I might take that, say that aloud and ask them to suggest how the sister became a snake. Was she always one? Did it just happen? Let's think about the backstory. Was she always a snake? Or how did she become a snake? And then I'll ask about the sister's character. What kind of sister is she? What's your relationship with her like? What's she like? How does her being a snake affect you? And from that kind of silly game almost, you can kind of prompt ideas and get them to think about, just from one sentence, so much of a story is already implied and so much can be built from it. And then to take another example here, the cottage door creaked open. I've been expecting you, Katerina, came a crackly voice. And you can obviously do the similar questions with that. Why does the speaker have a crackly voice? Why is she expecting the visitor? Where is the cottage? Who is speaking? All of these questions prompt story ideas. Again, I'm pointing out there's no right or wrong answer. That's the magic of stories. It's up to you. And again, this activity is about freeing up ideas. So from this, after doing a few examples aloud, and hopefully they've kind of relaxed into it and had some ideas sparked, I'd ask them to suggest their own opening lines, and maybe then collectively as a class, you can do the same exercise from that. And of course, you can do the same thing with story endings and work backwards as you can from working forwards with the title or the opening line. For example, another one from the book is remind me to never ever wear Grandad's wig again. So the question there that arises is what on earth happened when they did wear Grandad's wig? So from there you can start to think about, you get the idea, there's lots of sparks of inspiration. And it's really getting back to that idea of writers like almost like explorers or detectives, even digging in, asking questions, and you do that digging and you'll unearth a story. Another way of sparking inspiration is from looking at newspaper headlines or newspaper stories or fascinating facts from particular areas, for example, hobbies that the students might be interested in. And I think using these non-fiction elements as inspiration can be especially good for students who are less imaginative, I suppose, who are less comfortable going wild with their imagination. So I might ask them to find some newspaper headlines that grab their attention, or maybe to research some fascinating facts about something that they're interested in. So it might be that they're obsessed with football, or they like dancing, or they love science or nature or space or dinosaurs. But this really is about giving that sense of agency again. So tasking them to find out something amazing about a subject they're interested in and to use that as the basis of a story. And again, this comes back to the fact that writing is personal. It's about you putting yourself into your work. Another tool I use to kind of overcome fear of the blank page and spark inspiration is through a few different flash fiction exercises, which can be a really great warm-up exercise to free up the imagination. And if you set a timer, it can give a great sense of urgency from having the clock ticking away. And I think, as we all know, sometimes you need a deadline to force us to get on with the task. So for this, I might ask students to transform 3 words into a short story in 5 minutes, with no time to sit there and worry about having a blank page. So you could give them sort of 3 random words, no matter what they might be, set the timer, and they have to come up with the story. And then to give them more agency, you could ask students to write down 3 words, swap with a partner, and then to do the same activity that way. And following on from that, another 5-minute frenzy that I've used quite well and can turn into some quite funny stories is to turn proverbs into super short stories. So you might take something like, look before you leap, have a discussion about what that means, what the proverb actually means, and then sort of think about it in a different way and think about what happens if you don't look first. Does the character step into something terrible? Do they accidentally crush something and unleash a magic genie? And I think asking questions will throw out lots of different ideas, and you can really use this to show how characters are suggested. There's obviously there's no character specifically mentioned in Look Before You Leap, but it's like the power of suggestion. Right, so we've now covered some different ways of sparking inspiration. So now we'll move into a few different ways, a few different elements of creating, of what you need, the different ingredients to create stories. So first up, I explain about characters, and I'll relate fictional characters back to real people. So we're back to what I said at the start about making writers real and making it relevant to real life. So I'll explain that how in the real world, it's people who make life interesting, and it's people who have huge impact on our lives. And it's actually the same thing in stories. And from that, it follows that characters are really a key ingredient to stories. They're what brings stories to life. They keep readers reading. They make readers care about your story. So then I might run a class discussion about characters who've had an impact on them. So it's again them sharing how they've engaged with characters. It's that personal response. In terms of an activity to create characters off the page, one thing I do usually in my Martha Mayhem events, because they're for younger students, I'll use costumes or visual prompts to spark character ideas. So I might do this almost as a sort of pass the parcel game, where I've got a box of props, which might be hats, wigs, different bits of costumes, glasses, different costume elements. Pass the box around a circle of students. When the music stops, they have to pick something out and invent a character from it, or preferably get into character from it. And then it can be quite a good exercise to use the same props with a different student, and they might come up with an entirely different character, which I think is a nice way of showing how we're all unique and how we respond differently to the same thing. And then another tool that you're probably already familiar with, but it's an old favourite that works, is to create character profiles. So you might have worksheets with things like name, age, appearance, occupation, likes, dislikes, strengths, weaknesses. And so if I've just done the costume activity, I'll ask them then to complete the workshop based on the character that they've just become. And again, as I'm doing this, or before they do it, I ask them to think about real people they know and to think about themselves for ideas. Again, it's reinforcing the link between real life and writing. Then I'll go on to explain a little bit about empathy, and I'll really emphasize how important empathy and having empathy is to writers, especially when it comes to creating impactful characters. You really need to know how to get into someone else's shoes, to see the world through their eyes. And activities for this might be, for example, for them to write a dear diary, a day in the life of a character that they've just created a profile for. Or flip it on its head and ask them to write a day in the life story based on a baddie from a book they've read. And I think getting them to write about what isn't necessarily their favourite character, but to write about the enemy or the evil baddie, encourages them to think about how writers have to get under the skin of all kinds of characters, not just the ones they like. And linked to empathy, I talk a little bit then about motivation. I'll explain that another key element of story writing and creating characters is understanding motivation, understanding what a person wants or needs, and understanding that motivation is what drives people to overcome problems and obstacles. And to do that, I might ask them to give examples from their own lives. For example, what's your motivation for keeping your room tidy? What's your motivation for playing football? What's your motivation for doing your homework on time? And then I might share some of my own motivations too from my writing work. It's again making it personal and not having that divide. Is making writing real again. So of course it follows then that thinking about your own motivations also applies to the characters that you're creating. So as an activity, I might ask them to identify the motivations of characters from books that you've read as a group. And I'd also ask them to revisit characters that they've created. So maybe some of the characters that they've written a character profile for, to go back to revisit those characters and to think about their motivations. So it's all about adding meat to the bone, fleshing out the characters. And then I will do a little bit about dialogue. And as previously, I would invite them to discuss and think about the power of speech patterns in real people and what speech patterns reveal about people, and explain that that obviously also applies to characters. So I'll ask them to think about how one of the characters they created would talk. What kinds of words would they use? Have they got a broad vocabulary? Do they use slang, or do they speak in a formal language? Do they talk quickly, or do they talk in a more slow and considered way? What kind of speech patterns do they have? Do they have a catchphrase, or do they use certain words a lot? So I'll ask them to think about themselves, how they talk, and the difference between how they talk and maybe their friends or family talk, and then to relate that back to the characters. And as an activity, I'd ask them to write a dialogue scene between two characters, and then they can act that out with a partner. And preferably that's something you could do as a whole group activity, so everyone's sharing their characterization and everyone's sharing their dialogue. Right, so now moving on to another big topic of writing. It's what I call word wizardry, which is basically descriptive language. So I would then, first of all, ask them in the same way that I just looked at for dialogue. I'd ask them to flesh out one of their character profiles, thinking in more detail about adjectives that describe their appearance and their personality. And at this point, I'd really ask them to consider all the senses, how they smell, how they feel, how they move, how they sound. And again, I'll give them context and purpose, explaining the point of this, the point of using what I call word wizardry, the point of thinking about these adjectives is to make the character seem more real, more convincing, to make them seem alive, like they're a real person. So again, back to relating it to real life. I'm sticking with word wizardry and moving on to looking at metaphors and similes. There's a game that you can play called the musical metaphors game, and I just kind of like to do this again to free up ideas and kind of have a sense of fun about it. So I might gather an assortment of objects in a bag, so I could use the same bags, the same objects that I've previously used, sit students in a circle. And again, it's kind of pass the parcel scenario. Pass the bag around the circle as the music plays. When the music stops, the person holding the bag must blind pick an object from the bag and invent a simile or metaphor inspired by it. And then you can keep repeating that with new objects. And I guess it's the idea of trying to inspire a sense of having fun with language. It can be silly, it could be accurate, it could be interesting. And it's that sense of purpose as well, bringing the object to life and thinking about it in a different way, thinking about it in an inventive way that will engage your readers. And related to that, you can bring all the word wizardry skills together, adjectives, similes and metaphors, through what I call objects in depth. So they can revisit one of the objects they previously chose to write about, but this time they need to really describe it in detail. So whereas before it was used to spark a story narrative, this time it's all about really focusing in on that object. How does it feel, as well as how does it look? What's it used for? Maybe thinking about what it's used for could inspire some extra interesting word wizardry. And again, I'll explain the context for that. It's about improving their descriptive powers, which will make their writing much more appealing and engaging to their readers. And then if you're engaging in one of the bigger projects I mentioned, you could also throw in that it's because it's going to be published in the school magazine, or it might be entered for a competition, or it might be read by an author that you like. Another key element of word wizardry is about adding atmosphere. So again, I'll discuss what atmosphere is and as a class, and explain that atmosphere is what makes readers feel like they're inside a story world, and it plays a big part in keeping them hooked. So I might show this through reading passages from books they've read, and then after reading it aloud, I'll ask them to suggest what the atmosphere is, how the author created it. And moving on from that, I think talking about atmosphere is a really great way to introduce the idea of genres, explaining basically that different story genres have a different atmosphere. For example, it might be thrilling or scary or funny, and it might change as your character goes on their story journey. And then I'll explain that to create atmosphere, and to make your readers feel like they're in your story world, you need to use all the senses. You need to use all your word wizardry skills. And from talking about atmosphere, it leads well into writing, to exploring the idea of settings to create an atmosphere of place. And it also leads well into writing scary stories. So you could try the trip of a lifetime tale and ask students to write about a place that means something to them. It might be something somewhere they've visited, somewhere they had an amazing holiday, or somewhere they did something exciting, or it may be somewhere that they really want to go. And to get them started on that, I'll ask questions to prompt ideas. and again reminding them to think about the atmosphere, to tell them that their readers really need to feel that they're in that place. Another great jumping point from talking about atmosphere is to start writing scary stories, explaining that atmosphere is very important to scary stories. And I might begin by asking them to write their own scary stories through guided activities. So they might want to list some upsetting adjectives or scary speech verbs or menacing mannerism words to get them going. And you can either do this, then I'd probably start off by doing it in a semi-constructed way with a framework, asking them to choose a creepy character, to select a scary setting, or better still, to think up their own. And then I'll ask them to write the story as a timed activity, giving them that sense of urgency, and then to read the story aloud. And then after they've done it, I'll ask them to review their stories to see how they might add extra atmosphere. Moving on from that, now they've got a sense of creating characters and atmosphere, I'll introduce the idea of the mountain map. So we're looking at plotting in a bit more detail. So whereas initially I kind of gave them the 3-course meal idea in a simplistic way to plot it, I might then talk about the mountain map, which is a really great way for them to think about how to plot an adventure story. So explaining you've got your beginning, where you introduce your characters and setting, then you move on to the build-up, what happens to really get your story going. And then, in all good adventure stories, they need a problem. What goes wrong for your character? Then your character needs to resolve it, so things are kind of evened out a little bit, but then explain that they need to face a second setback, so the mountain peaks rising again. Then they'll have a second resolution where they figure out how to solve that problem, and then eventually they reach the journey's end. The character is back on safe ground. So I think that's a really useful way to get them to think about the sense of tension, the sense of pacing, the sense of plotting. So what I might do is, after introducing the idea of the mountain map, I'll move on to exploring adventure stories and talk about how adventure stories have gripping plots. It's a story with lots of twists and turns, ups and downs, like a mountain range, and they force characters to face obstacles, which is what keeps the story exciting. And I'll explain that each obstacle is harder than the last, each demands more from the character. In terms of an activity, I'll provide them with a mountain map template so they can plot their adventure onto, and then they can actually, from that, use the guided template to write up their story. And then, especially important here, to remind them to think about their word wizardry skills. And then, of course, you can use this same, while they work really well for adventure stories, you can also use the mountain map to write other stories. For example, quests are a great one, explaining that Quest is going on a difficult journey to find something of importance, like the scientist's search for new snakes that is mentioned in You Can Write Awesome Stories. So again, you might create a profile, you'll identify the motivation, select a setting, select an object, mountain map the plot, and then write the quest. And other ways, kind of moving on for that, now they're equipped with the idea of the mountain map and have got a strong sense of word wizardry and structure, I like to try a few exercises around the idea of making stories social, which is when I explore a number of different genres in a collective social way. So I might take a class vote on what story subject they'd like to write about. So it's that sense of agency again. So for example, sports stories, they're usually a pretty popular one. And I'll sort of explain to them that actually that's a really great idea, because sports stories cover lots, they can actually cover lots of different writing techniques. They might have the tension of thrillers, they might have the suspense of mysteries. And in doing this, I might also encourage students to write from their own experience. So for example, there might be a dramatic match or game that they've either watched or participated in. And you can do the same, say, with animals as inspiration, which is also another popular one. One activity I like to do around animals is to ask them to write their own animal fable. So then you get to talk about what fables are and the point of fables. And I don't know, for example, they could rewrite their own version of The Tortoise and the Hare. Or another way of sparking inspiration, of using animals as inspiration, is to find out a fascinating fact about their favourite animal, or an animal that's really interesting. For example, hummingbirds are the only bird that flies backwards, and from that fact they could kind of write their own story. And you can do the same also with nature. Maybe you could write a thriller about a hurricane or a volcano, or it could be a drama about a community efforts to protect a local nature reserve. And I think nature is also a great way to introduce things like symbolism and foreshadowing. So if you want to introduce those elements to students' writing, nature stories are a great way to do that. So now I'm going to talk through some of the bigger projects that I mentioned at the start. So this is in relation to social writing, and also that idea of giving a real purpose to writing. So we've gone through lots of different ways to inspire and spark different specific story skills. But now we're going to look at the idea of maybe setting up a school newspaper or magazine project to give that real sense of urgency and real sense of agency and reason. I think also, if you're able to do it, having a school newspaper or magazine is a great way for students to explore all kinds of writing, alongside things like design skills or editorial skills and research skills. It can be a really fun thing for the whole school or whole class to get involved in. So I think really a good way to begin this, which they always love, is to do some market research. So they can do some show and tell and bring in some of their favourite magazines. You can bring some in as well to spark different comparisons. Ask them to think about the content, the tone of voice, what the magazines look like. So really go through a selection, and then they can think about the kind of thing they want to create themselves. Once you've done that, this is one of my favourite parts, is asking students to identify different experts among them. So ask who's good at what, who likes sport, who wants to cover the news reports. And that, I think, really the sense of giving them that title, they're the experts in their field and they're going to write about and manage what they're passionate about. And after they've done that, you can, of course, give your newspaper a name. And once you've decided what kind of style it will have, what the content will be. And then I would encourage them to self-assign themselves roles. So you might have different writing departments, and each of these presents different in-depth opportunities to explore different kinds of writing. So you might have news reporters, sports correspondents, you might have book reviewers, so then you could run separate offshoot workshops on how to write effective book reviews. You might have fashion experts, so the people in that team might want to research maybe some local fashion designers that they could interview. You might have science editors, and I think in that you can, looking after that area, you could run a separate workshop on how to write clearly, how to convey quite complicated scientific information in a clear way to people. You could have travel writers. And then alongside that, you might have a number of cross-departmental roles. So there might be an advertising team, and then you could run separate workshops on copywriting and to look at persuasive language and maybe the ability to express something in as few words as possible. And then if you've got other people who are good at illustrating or have got design skills, it's kind of really about everyone being an expert. And then, of course, leading on from that design skills, you might want to have comic strips and as part of the newspaper. And I think running a separate comic strip workshop can really lend itself well too. And I think that can be especially good for kids who are less confident in their written work and less confident with their imagination. And you can explain that's another way of telling stories. And something else that can also work well if you're doing a bigger newspaper or magazine project is to do some outreach work. So you might have a press department as well, and that team of students will have to write a press release about the magazine and send it to local newspapers. And in that context, I think obviously writing a press release is a different type of writing skill. So then you're introducing, again, another sense of purpose. They need to think about who their audience is for the press release. Related to that, you can also form a relationship with your local newspaper. You could maybe invite journalists in from different departments to talk to students about their job, which again is about making writing real. These are people who write for a living, and they can talk about their particular area of the newspaper. You can also get maybe if you form a good relationship with them, the newspaper might cover your newspaper in there. So again, it's that sense of audience for the project. And you can also do additional outreach work, contacting local community groups, conservation projects, maybe old age pensioner groups, social groups. So it's again that sense of purpose and a sense of community to what the students are producing. Another idea for a bigger project around social writing is you could ask students to create a school handbook for new starters at the school. And again, that provides a strong sense of purpose. This is about students sharing their knowledge, sharing their insider knowledge of the school to put new pupils at ease. They could think about what they wished they'd known before they started, what they were excited about, what they were worried about, to put other students at ease. And you can really give students agency to identify what they think should be in the handbook. And maybe they'll want to make maps again. They might want to research school history. You might want to interview teachers and have teacher profiles in it, interviews with pupils with specific roles. Yeah, it's really kind of up to the students, but I think that sense of purpose is really important. And it could be something that's kept in the school library, or maybe if there's funds, it's something that could be given to new pupils. So it's like it's a real thing that exists in the real world. And again, it kind of, like the newspaper project, it will encourage lots of different types of writing. And similar to that, something else that can be quite fun is to create a local travel guide. And really, again, you could, with this, you can think about how you might outreach this, or what the audience would be for this. Maybe it could go in your school library. Maybe it could also go in the local library, the local public library. Or again, you might want to make contact with a local newspaper, and they could feature the guide in it, or you could contact the local tourist board. And it's again about the students sharing their insider knowledge, what they love about their local town, their village, their area, and with an audience in mind. And kind of related to that, you might want to set up a school literary festival. And I think, again, that really implements the all-important sense of purpose. This gives students a reason to write their stories in the first place, if they keep in mind that in a few months' time they're going to be reading or performing or organising a school book festival. Again, it can have a range of roles. You might have story writers and poets who can read their work. You might have presenters and interviewers to host events. You might have marketing copywriters who write newsletters about the fest. And you'll also need people who are good at illustrating and art and design. And you could even ask a children's author to be part of it. It might be one of the authors that you've been in touch with throughout the year, or someone who's come to do an event with you. And also, as I mentioned at the start, another great way to create that sense of purpose is through entering competitions which have a clear sense of purpose, a real strong motivator. You have to follow set criteria as well. You're working to a strict word count, you're working to a deadline. There might be other criteria that you have to follow, maybe the theme of the story. And I think students can be motivated by having readers, in this case the judges, motivated by the potential to win prizes, and motivated by the potential for recognition, both for themselves and also for the class and the school. And it's that satisfaction maybe of being part of something bigger. And one competition I'd like to mention is the Collins Big Cat Competition 2021, which I think launches next week. And this is really fun. really fabulous thing to be part of. It's all based on a new series in the Big Cat range, and the competition invites students to create a 300-word short story, which is to write their own new adventure story, and or alternatively they can come up with their own new character. It's really great prizes, so that will be something to maybe follow up with after this event and get involved with. And now we're nearly at the end of the presentation, the last word. Really my top tips, sort of above and to frame everything I've just gone through, is to advise students to read about what they're interested in. Everything counts, whether it's comics and sports writing, books about science, dinosaurs, nature. It's really that sense of fun and having that freedom and agency to choose what you're in, to choose what you want to read, to choose what you want to write about. And also might suggest that if they get stuck or feel their word wizardry is starting to wane, suggest they do something physical to free their thoughts. Take some deep breaths, do some stretches, try one of the 5-minute frenzy activities. And I think it's also important to reinforce the idea that all writers get writing block, and that pushing through those blocks, overcoming obstacles to create something truly unique, is what makes writing all the more pleasurable. And so for the last word, thank you very much for listening. You can see some contacts there. That's my Twitter account and lots of different Colin's social media accounts and contacts to follow. And I think now we're going to move to questions.